Hi, welcome to another Flashback Friday. The show we're saluting today is that extravagant song and dance show 42nd Street, based on the Warner Brothers movie from 1933. When that movie was filmed and released, it turned out to be a critical turning point in the evolution of movie musicals. You see, in 1927, Warner Brothers had created a revolution when they released The Jazz Singer, the first so-called talking picture. After that, all the studios had to learn how to make talking pictures. They brought in actors from Broadway. They sometimes brought in whole shows from Broadway and filmed them in a studio in California. But their early cameras were clunky and heavy and they couldn't move them around much. And the result was these movies all looked very stage-bound and uninteresting. And after a few years of dozens of these clunky movie musicals, audiences just weren't buying them anymore. In fact, movie theater owners put out on the marquee the words, "not a musical," as an inducement to get people to come into the theater. Around this time in New York in 1932, a Broadway chorus boy named Bradford Ropes decided he would turn his attention to being a novelist. And he wrote a book called 42nd Street about the seamy underbelly of putting on a Broadway show. His lead characters all had very questionable virtue. The director, Julian Marsh, was British, and he was involved not with Peggy Sawyer, the ingenue, but with Billy Lawler, the leading tenor in the company. Peggy Sawyer, in the book From Maine, wants to become a star, and she does, and she becomes a monster once she does become one. Dorothy Brock is a fading star with a drug problem, using her personal wiles to stay in the game. It's not a very attractive picture of show people, but it's a fascinating book with a slangy tone to it. And when you read it, you do get the feeling that you're understanding what it was like to be in a Broadway show in 1932. Well, Warner Brothers, always on the cusp of the new trends, had done very well making gangster pictures and movies that were ripped from today's headlines and did realistic depictions of what was going on in the Depression era of the country. Somebody at Warner Brothers got a hold of this novel and thought of it not as a movie musical or a fantasy, but as a gritty look at an industry. So they started trying to adapt it for the screen. Even though censorship was not very strong in 1933, there were certain things they knew they had to leave out. So in the film screenplay, Julian Marsh is an American director. Billy Lawler, the tenor, is interested in Peggy Sawyer, who stays nice for the whole time. And they were able to rework it enough and yet keep the gritty underbelly of the story so that this looked like a Warner Brothers picture. They entrusted it to director Lloyd Bacon, who knew how to do things efficiently and on time and with a lot of creativity. And they entrusted the 3 musical numbers to Busby Berkeley, who had made a good name for himself on Broadway and now was doing films in California. Busby Berkeley would stage numbers that were supposedly taking place on stage, but then he would move into them in an almost surrealistic way, letting the camera move through the dancers and expanding the playing space into something that could only be called Busby Berkeley Land. When the movie opened in 1933, it was a sensation, and it made movie musicals popular all over again. It also led to a whole string of movies at Warner Brothers, choreographed by Busby Berkeley, usually with music by Harry Warren and Al Dubin, and usually starring Ruby Keeler and Dick Powell, who had been in 42nd Street. But by the 1950s, these movies were pretty much being seen only on late-night TV. And by the late 60s and early 70s, they were being spoofed in shows like Dames at Sea off-Broadway or on The Carol Burnett Show. But in 1980, Broadway impresario David Merrick, also known as the Abominable Showman, announced he was doing a stage version of 42nd Street. We all wondered what the tone of it would be. Would it be a parody or would it be sincere? We all guessed, correctly as it turned out, that they would include songs from all of those Harry Warren, Al Dubin, Busby Berkeley movies. They hired director-choreographer Gower Champion, who had worked so well with David Merrick on Carnival and Hello, Dolly. And he was a very smart guy with a history in movie musicals, so we figured he'd know what he was doing. They took the show to Washington, D.C. to try it out of town, and we started hearing rumors that the show was in difficulty, There were songs coming in and going out. We heard that Gower Champion was dating the leading lady, Wanda Richard, but we heard she was very good in the show. Finally, they finished their engagement in Washington and came up to New York to begin previews at the Winter Garden Theater. Well, David Merrick was famous for his publicity stunts, and he announced that he had heard there was a critic from the New York Times who was going to sneak into one of the previews and review the show before he was supposed to. So David Merrick banished all the audience from the previews, refunded their money, and night after night the cast performed to an empty house. Some of them started bringing in stuffed teddy bears and other toys to put in the seats so they would have some faces looking back at them as they performed. Finally, David Merrick announced the show was ready, it was going to open. He told all the press to come and to stick around to the very end of the show because there would be a special announcement. So they did the opening night performance. It was fabulous. The show turned out to be sincere and heartfelt and a great tribute to the joys of entertaining. It was just a wonderful evening. And then at the end of it, David Merrick came out on stage. Everybody cheered. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight is a tragedy." And everybody laughed because obviously it was a huge success. And he said, no, you don't understand. This afternoon at Sloan Kettering Hospital, Gower Champion died. That was a shock to the cast. It was a shock to the audience. It was something that had never happened in the theater before. And certainly by the next day, 42nd Street was the lead headline on newspapers around the world. That launched a production in New York that ran for 8.5 years, many Tony Awards, other accolades in productions around the globe. And it turned out to be a wonderful, enduring show. One of the original cast members was a fellow named John Engstrom, whom Gower Champion had selected to be a dance captain on the show. Well, for the next several years, John would go put up productions of 42nd Street that were immaculate recreations of what Gower Champion had in mind. And we have been so blessed to have John's friendship and to have John come to Wichita in 1989, and again in 1998, and again in 2014, and put together an absolutely perfect version of 42nd Street. Our cast each time was wonderful, and each time that John came, that meant that our cast got to do the show with only 1 degree of separation from what Gower Champion's original ideas behind the show were. The production we did in 2014 was the first time we got to build all new sets and costumes. The wonderful atmospheric sets were by Bruce Brockman, and the fantastic costumes were by Debbie Roberts, who came first to Music Theater Wichita as a dresser on our 1989 42nd Street, and then whose daughter Darcy Roberts toured with the show internationally and came back and played Peggy Sawyer for us in 1998. Debbie ended up running our costume shop for more than 20 years, and her costumes for 42nd Street are just wonderful. This one, as I mentioned, was directed and choreographed by John Engstrom. Hector Guerrero was his assistant on this one. And our cast included Damon Kirsch as Julian Marsh, Tessa Grady as Peggy Sawyer, Tracy Lohr as Dorothy Brock, the star, Sean Wiley as Billy Lawler, the tenor, with great work from Patty Reeder and Robert Ariza and Amy Baker Schweetall and Jacob Chancellor, and a wonderful big cast of tapping folks. The musical direction was by Thomas W. Douglas, and we hope you will push on the YouTube link and enjoy some clips from our 2014 production of 42nd Street.